The cold hit Evelina Marsh first, before the shame did. She stood at the edge of the grand ballroom, the invitation crushed in her gloved hand, and watched every table fill up around her like water closing over a stone. Nobody looked at her. Nobody moved to make room. The New Year's Eve gala at the Ashcombe estate was the biggest event of the season, and she had walked into it alone, knowing exactly what waited for her, and still it stung worse than she expected. 3 months ago, her name meant something in the city. Now it meant whispers behind fans, sideways glances from women who used to call her dear friend, and empty chairs at tables where she used to be welcomed without question. Her father's business had collapsed in the autumn, dragging the family name down with it, and the people who once smiled at her now smiled at each other while she stood in the cold like a stranger. She had almost turned back at the door. The only reason she hadn't was a promise she made to herself in the carriage on the way over. She would not let them see her run. Grief and pride made strange companions, but tonight they were the only two things keeping her spine straight. The orchestra played something bright and hopeful, completely out of step with how she felt. Chandeliers threw gold light across the marble floor, catching on jewelry and silk, and the careless laughter of people who had never once worried about whether they would eat next month. Evelina scanned the room for a single friendly face. She found none. Even Charlotte Bryce, who had once shared secrets with her under blankets at boarding school, turned her head away the moment their eyes met. A waiter passed with a tray of champagne. Evelina took a glass, not because she wanted it, but because holding something gave her hands a purpose. She sipped it slowly, standing near a marble pillar, trying to look like a woman who had somewhere to be rather than a woman who had nowhere to sit. Minutes crawled by. The clock on the far wall ticked toward 11, and with every passing minute the crowd around her seemed to grow louder, closer, more impossible to enter. She thought of her father, waiting at home with his ledgers and his silence, and she thought of her mother, gone 2 winters now, who used to tell her that a Marsh never begs for a seat at anyone's table. "Then I suppose I'll stand," she murmured to herself, and the words came out steadier than she felt. She had decided, quietly, that she would finish her drink, offer a polite excuse to nobody in particular, and leave before the countdown to midnight began. There was no reason to stay and be reminded, minute after minute, of exactly how far she had fallen. She set her empty glass on a passing tray and turned toward the door. That was when the room changed. It started as a ripple, a shift in the noise, heads turning one by one toward the long table at the front of the hall, the one reserved for the Ashcombe family and their most honored guest. Evelina followed the gazes without meaning to, and her breath caught in her throat. Duke Alaric Sinclair had risen from his seat. She knew him only by reputation, the way most of the city did. Young, unmarried, famously private, a man who attended exactly as many events as duty required and not one more. He was tall, composed, with the kind of quiet authority that made rooms go silent without him raising his voice. Women spent entire seasons trying to earn a second glance from him and left disappointed. He was, by every account, the last person in this room likely to notice a woman standing alone by a pillar. And yet he was looking directly at her. For a moment, Evelina thought she had mistaken his gaze for someone behind her. She almost turned to check, but his eyes did not move, and slowly, deliberately, he lifted his hand and gestured toward the empty seat beside his own. The music seemed to fade. Conversations dimmed into murmurs. Every face in the room turned first to the Duke, then to her, then back again, as if trying to solve a puzzle that made no sense. Evelina felt her pulse rise into her throat. Surely this was a mistake. Surely there was another woman closer to him, someone he actually meant to call forward. But no one else moved. No one else dared to move. She stood frozen for a heartbeat that felt endless, weighing humiliation against curiosity, pride against the simple, aching desire not to be alone for one more minute in a room full of people who had already decided she didn't belong. Then, before she could talk herself out of it, her feet started walking. Each step across that marble floor felt like walking across a stage with no script. The whispers followed her, hissed behind hands and fans, sharper now that she was moving toward the one man nobody expected her to reach. Charlotte Bryce's mouth had fallen slightly open. An older woman near the front actually clutched her pearls, as if the sight itself required steadying. Evelina kept her chin level and her eyes forward, the way her mother taught her. Whatever this was, whatever it cost her tomorrow in gossip and speculation, she would not let them see her flinch tonight. When she reached the table, the Duke did not smile, not exactly, but something in his expression softened, some tension she hadn't noticed leaving his shoulders. Up close he was younger than she expected, with sharp gray eyes that held her gaze without apology. "Miss Marsh," he said, his voice low enough that only she and the two nearest guests could hear it, "I believe this seat has been waiting for you." She hesitated, one hand resting on the back of the chair. "Your Grace, I don't believe we've been introduced." "We haven't," he agreed simply. "That can be remedied over supper if you're willing." There was nothing mocking in his tone, no trace of pity, none of the careful cruelty she had grown used to over the past few months. Just a plain, quiet offer, made in front of half the city's most powerful families, as though it were the most natural thing in the world. Evelina sat. The moment she did, the room exhaled around her, conversations resuming at double their previous volume, though she could feel eyes still darting toward their table every few seconds. She kept her hands folded in her lap, aware suddenly of every fraying thread on her older gown, every place where the fabric had been mended rather than replaced. "You didn't have to do that," she said quietly, once the nearest guests had returned to their own conversations. "I know," the Duke replied. He studied her for a moment, his expression unreadable. "I wanted to. Half this room is going to talk about nothing else for a week. Let them." He said it without heat, without concern, as though the opinions crowding the ballroom mattered to him about as much as the weather. "I find most conversations in rooms like this are dull. Yours, I suspect, will not be." Evelina almost laughed, despite herself, despite the strangeness of the entire evening. "You don't know that. We've spoken for a matter of seconds." "I know enough," he said, and something in his tone made her look at him more closely. "I know you walked into a room where you weren't wanted and stayed on your own 2 feet for the better part of an hour instead of leaving in tears. I know you didn't come looking for pity, and you certainly didn't come looking for me. That tells me quite a lot, actually." She studied his face, trying to find the trick in it, the angle, the reason a man like him would risk his own reputation on a woman whose name currently meant scandal and ruin to half the city. She found nothing but calm, steady honesty. "Why me?" she finally asked. "There are a dozen women in this room who would have crossed the floor the moment you looked their way." Something flickered behind his eyes, gone before she could name it. "Perhaps," he said, "but I wasn't looking their way." Before she could press further, a server arrived with the first course, and the moment slipped past, though it lingered in her mind the rest of the evening. Around them, the ballroom moved on with its noise and its dancing and its endless, restless gossip. But at their table, something quieter had begun, something that felt strangely like the first solid ground Evelina had stood on in months. She did not know yet what it would cost her. She did not know about the letters waiting to be discovered, the family secrets buried under polite smiles, or the long nights ahead when pride and love would pull her in opposite directions. All she knew, as the clock crept closer to midnight and the crowd began counting down together, was that, for the first time since her family's fall from grace, someone had looked at her and seen something worth saving a seat for. As supper continued, Evelina noticed small things she hadn't expected. The Duke did not perform for the room the way most powerful men did, raising his voice for effect or steering conversation toward his own achievements. He asked her questions, and then actually waited for the answers, his attention steady in a way that made the noise around them fade into the background. She found herself talking more freely than she had in months, describing small memories of her mother, a garden she used to tend before the family moved to smaller rooms, a book she had read 3 times because she couldn't afford a new one. He listened to all of it without a trace of judgment, and once, when she mentioned her father's failed business almost as an apology, he simply said, "Fortunes rise and fall. Character is the only thing that doesn't change with them." The words settled into her chest like a small, unexpected warmth. Across the ballroom, Charlotte Bryce whispered furiously behind her fan to another woman, both of them glancing toward the head table every few seconds. Evelina caught the movement but found, to her own surprise, that it bothered her less than it would have an hour ago. Whatever this evening turned out to mean tomorrow, right now she was warm, she was seen, and she was no longer standing alone by a pillar waiting to disappear. A young musician near the string section caught the Duke's eye at one point, and he excused himself briefly to speak with the orchestra leader, requesting a piece Evelina recognized from her childhood, an old waltz her mother used to hum while working in the garden. When he returned to the table, and the first notes rose into the air, he glanced at her as if to ask whether she noticed. She had. Something tightened in her throat, gratitude and grief tangled together in a way she didn't have words for yet. "You didn't need to do that either," she said softly. "I know," he said again, the same quiet answer as before, as though kindness required no more explanation than that. Servants moved through the crowd refilling glasses as the final hour of the year ticked away. Evelina watched the Duke's hands as he spoke, steady and unhurried, nothing like the nervous energy of the younger men who usually crowded around wealthy women at these events. He did not seem to need her approval or anyone else's. He simply seemed to have decided, somewhere in the space of one glance across a crowded room, that she was worth the risk to his own reputation, and having decided it, he did not waver. Near 11:30, an older gentleman approached their table, bowing slightly to the Duke before addressing Evelina directly, an unusual courtesy she hadn't expected after months of being overlooked entirely. He introduced himself as a friend of her late mother, and spoke kindly of a woman Evelina hadn't heard praised in public for a very long time. She felt tears threaten and blinked them back, grateful when the Duke offered no comment, only a steady, understanding glance that told her she didn't need to perform composure for his benefit. When the gentleman moved on, the Duke leaned slightly closer. "Your mother sounds like she was remarkable." "She was," Evelina said, and for the first time all evening, the words came out without the careful armor she usually wrapped around anything to do with her family. "I miss her every day." He didn't offer empty comfort or rush to fill the silence that followed. He simply let it sit between them, respectful and unhurried, until the orchestra shifted into something livelier, and the crowd began drifting toward the center of the floor to dance. When the countdown reached its final numbers and the room erupted in cheers, Evelina Marsh sat beside a Duke who was, by every account, unreachable and felt, against all reason, that her year was about to change. She had no idea how right she was. By morning, the entire city knew her name again, though not in the way it had been known before. Evelina woke to the sound of her father packing outside her bedroom door, a habit he had picked up in the months since his business collapsed, as though motion alone could outrun their debts. When she came downstairs, she found him standing by the window with a newspaper in his shaking hands, his face caught somewhere between disbelief and desperate hope. "They're saying the Duke asked for you by name," he said, before she had even reached the bottom step. "That he stood up in front of half the city and called you to his table." "He did," Evelina said carefully, taking the newspaper from him. The society page had already turned last night into a headline full of breathless speculation about the reclusive Duke Alaric Sinclair and the ruined Marsh daughter he had apparently chosen out of an entire ballroom of eligible women. She scanned the words with a growing unease, watching her private evening become public property overnight. Her father's hands trembled as he lowered himself into the nearest chair. "Evelina, do you understand what this could mean? If he were to court you, truly court you, our debts, the house, everything could be." "Papa," she interrupted, sharper than she intended. "He offered me a seat at supper, that's all this was." But even as she said it, she wasn't entirely certain she believed it herself. Her father's desperation was not new, but it had never been aimed so directly at her before. In the weeks that followed, she watched him change, growing more insistent, more anxious, dropping careful hints about the importance of encouraging the Duke's attention rather than questioning it. He began speaking of the family's situation in ways he never had before, numbers and deadlines and the names of creditors who had grown impatient with promises. Evelina listened to all of it with a tightening chest, understanding for the first time just how much weight had quietly shifted onto her shoulders the moment she crossed that ballroom floor. 3 days after the gala, a carriage bearing the Sinclair crest arrived outside their modest townhouse, drawing curious neighbors to their windows before the driver had even opened the door. Evelina watched from behind the curtain as the Duke stepped down, dressed simply for once, without the ceremonial weight of the ball, and approached their door with the same unhurried confidence she remembered from the night before. Her father answered before the housekeeper could even move, ushering the Duke inside with an eagerness that made Evelina's stomach twist with embarrassment. "Your Grace," her father said, bowing lower than necessary. "What an honor. Please come in, sit, allow me to." "I've come to see your daughter, Mr. Marsh," the Duke said, polite but direct, cutting through the flattery without unkindness. "If she's willing to receive me." All eyes turned to Evelina, standing at the top of the stairs. She descended slowly, aware of her father's hopeful expression and the Duke's steady gaze, both waiting for her answer as though it carried very different weights for each of them. "I'm willing," she said finally, and led him to the small sitting room at the back of the house, the one with mismatched furniture and curtains that had faded years ago, far from the grandeur of the world he usually moved through. If the modesty of the room bothered him, he gave no sign of it. He sat where she gestured, accepted tea from a chipped cup without comment, and waited until the door closed behind her father, who had lingered anxiously in the hallway before finally retreating, before speaking again. "I imagine this morning was difficult for you," he said. "You could say that." Evelina wrapped both hands around her own cup, grateful for something to hold. "Half the city thinks you've made a declaration you haven't actually made. And the other half? The other half thinks I trapped you somehow, charmed you into humiliating yourself in front of everyone who matters." She met his eyes directly. "Neither version is particularly flattering to either of us." To her surprise, he almost smiled. "No," he agreed, "neither is." "Then why come here? Why give them more to talk about?" He set his cup down carefully, considering his answer with the same unhurried patience he seemed to bring to everything. "Because I don't particularly care what they talk about, Miss Marsh. I care whether the woman I invited to my table found the evening as interesting as I did, or whether I imagined the entire thing." The directness of it caught her off guard. She had expected careful diplomacy, vague reassurances, the kind of practiced charm men of his position usually offered. Instead, he simply asked plainly whether she had wanted to be there. "I didn't imagine it," she admitted quietly. "It was the first evening in months I didn't feel like a ghost haunting my own life." Something shifted in his expression, gentler than before. "Then perhaps we've established enough to continue, regardless of what the papers print." Over the following weeks, his visits became a quiet, steady rhythm in her life. Though never frequent enough to be called courtship outright, and never so rare that she stopped anticipating them. He asked about her days, her small routines, the books she read to escape the tension at home. He never once asked about her father's debts, though she suspected he knew the exact figures better than she did. It was during one such visit, nearly a month after the gala, that Evelina first heard the name that would come to complicate everything. "My aunt has requested to meet you," Alaric said one afternoon, stirring his tea with more attention than the task required. "Lady Constance. She manages a great deal of the family's affairs since my brother passed." Evelina straightened slightly. She had heard of Lady Constance Sinclair, a formidable woman known throughout society for her sharp tongue and sharper judgment, rarely impressed by anyone who hadn't been born into old money and older expectations. "I take it she does not share your indifference to public opinion." "She does not," he said, with the faintest trace of dry humor. "She believes reputation is the only currency that truly matters. She will likely ask you difficult questions, and she will not soften them for your comfort." "Should I be worried?" He considered this honestly, rather than offering easy comfort. "She can be difficult, but she is not unfair in the end, whatever her methods along the way. I would rather you meet her prepared than blindsided." The warning settled over Evelina like a shadow, though she tried not to let it show. She had faced whispers and cold shoulders for months now. She told herself one sharp-tongued aunt could hardly be worse. But something in Alaric's careful phrasing, the deliberate way he chose his words, suggested there was more beneath the surface of this meeting than a simple introduction. 2 days later, a formal invitation arrived, requesting her presence at the Sinclair estate for afternoon tea, addressed in Lady Constance's own hand. Evelina read it 3 times before folding it carefully and setting it aside, aware that whatever tentative peace she had found over the past month was about to be tested in earnest. Her father, upon hearing the news, could barely contain his excitement, already speaking as though the matter were settled, as though one afternoon tea would somehow erase every debt weighing down their household. Evelina found his optimism exhausting in a way she couldn't quite explain, a pressure building beneath her ribs every time he mentioned the family's fortunes turning, as though she were nothing more than the instrument of their rescue rather than a woman making her own choices. On the morning of the visit, she dressed carefully in her best remaining gown, mended so skillfully at the seams that only she knew where the repairs were, and rode to the Sinclair estate with her heart beating faster than she wanted to admit. The estate itself was larger and colder than she expected, all stone and symmetry, portraits of stern ancestors lining hallways that seemed to stretch on without end. A servant led her to a sitting room where Lady Constance waited, seated perfectly straight in a high-backed chair, her expression unreadable as Evelina entered. "Miss Marsh," Lady Constance said, her voice cool and measured, "please sit." Evelina obeyed, folding her hands in her lap, aware of the older woman's sharp eyes assessing every detail of her appearance, her posture, her composure. "I will speak plainly," Lady Constance continued, without preamble. "My nephew has made an unusual choice, and unusual choices invite unusual scrutiny. I have heard the stories of your father's failed business, his mounting debts, the desperation in the city's drawing rooms to see you married well before your family's situation grows worse. I would be a fool not to wonder whether the same desperation has found its way to you." The words landed like a slap, though Evelina kept her face carefully neutral. "I understand your concern, Lady Constance. I would likely feel the same in your position." "Then you understand why I must ask you directly. Do you love my nephew, Miss Marsh? Or do you love the solution he represents to your family's troubles?" The question hung in the air between them, sharper and more honest than anything Evelina had expected. She thought of her father's trembling hands, the newspaper headlines, the weeks of quiet visits and unhurried conversation that had slowly become the steadiest part of her days. "I have known your nephew for a little over a month," she said finally. "I would be lying if I claimed to love him, not yet, not in any way that means something lasting. But I would also be lying if I said his kindness hasn't been the only steady thing in my life since everything else fell apart. Whether that becomes love, I cannot promise you today. What I can promise is that I have not once asked him for anything beyond his company." Lady Constance studied her for a long moment, something unreadable shifting behind her sharp eyes. "That," she said finally, "is either the most honest answer I've received in this house in years, or the most carefully rehearsed one." I suppose you'll have to decide which, Evelina replied, holding the older woman's gaze without flinching. For the first time since she'd entered the room, something like the ghost of approval crossed Lady Constance's face. "Perhaps I will," she said. "Tea, Miss Marsh." The conversation that followed grew less combative, though never entirely comfortable, Lady Constance asking pointed questions about Evelina's upbringing, her mother, her understanding of the responsibilities that came with the Sinclair name. Evelina answered as honestly as she could, aware that every word was being weighed and measured against some invisible standard she couldn't fully see. As she rose to leave, Lady Constance offered one final observation, delivered without warmth but without malice either. "My nephew has not looked at a woman the way he looks at you since before his brother died, Miss Marsh. I would advise you to consider carefully what that means for both your sakes before this goes any further." On her way out through the long hallway, Evelina passed a portrait she hadn't noticed on her way in, a young man with the same sharp gray eyes as Alaric, though softer somehow, more open, painted before whatever had put the careful distance in the Duke's expression today. A woman stood near the painting, dressed in dark colors despite the season, staring up at it with an expression Evelina couldn't quite read. "That was Edmund," the woman said quietly without turning around. "Alaric's brother, my husband." Evelina stopped, uncertain whether to introduce herself or simply continue past. "I'm sorry for your loss," she said finally. "I didn't mean to intrude." "You're not intruding." The woman turned then, and Evelina recognized the same guarded caution in her eyes that she had felt from Lady Constance, though wrapped in something closer to grief than judgment. "You're Miss Marsh. I'm Lady Miriam, Edmund's widow." The name settled into place, another piece of a family history Evelina was only beginning to understand. "It's a pleasure to meet you, Lady Miriam, though I wish it were under different circumstances." "Alaric has spoken of you," Miriam said, studying her with open curiosity now. "More than he's spoken of anyone since Edmund died. I confess I didn't expect that from him again." "May I ask what happened? To your husband, I mean, if it isn't too painful a question." Something shuddered behind Miriam's eyes, quick and final. "That's a story for Alaric to tell when he's ready to tell it. I'll only say that this family carries more weight than the title suggests, Miss Marsh, and that weight has a way of falling on whoever stands closest to him." The warning, gentler than Lady Constance's but no less pointed, followed Evelina out of the estate and into the waiting carriage. She turned the words over during the long ride home, trying to piece together fragments of a story no one seemed willing to share directly. A brother dead too young, a widow dressed in mourning long after propriety required it, an aunt who spoke of responsibility as though it were armor against some old, unhealed wound. By the time the carriage reached her own street, the sky had turned the color of dull iron, threatening rain, and Evelina found herself less troubled by Lady Constance's pointed questions than by the quiet grief she had glimpsed in Lady Miriam's eyes, a grief that seemed to circle Alaric like something unfinished, waiting to surface. That evening, when Alaric arrived for his usual visit, she studied his face more carefully than before, searching for whatever shadow his family carried so carefully behind their composed expressions. He noticed, of course. He noticed everything. "You met Miriam," he said, not quite a question. "I did. She spoke well of you, though carefully, as did your aunt in her own way." "And what did you make of them both?" Evelina considered her answer honestly. "I made of them a family that has learned to guard something, though I couldn't tell you what. Your aunt asked whether I loved you or merely loved what marrying you might solve. Your sister mentioned your brother, then stopped herself before saying anything more." Something tightened in Alaric's jaw, brief and controlled. "Edmund's death is not a story I share easily, Evelina. Not because I don't trust you, but because some wounds don't close simply because time has passed over them. I'm not asking you to share it before you're ready," she said gently. "I only want you to know that I noticed, that I see there's more to this family than the calm you show the world." He studied her for a long moment, something unguarded flickering across his features before the composure returned. "There is," he admitted quietly, "more than you know, and I suspect the time is coming when you'll need to know all of it." The words lingered in the room long after he had gone, settling over Evelina with a weight she couldn't quite name, equal parts anticipation and unease, as though the quiet life she had begun building beside this careful, guarded man was only the surface of something far deeper, waiting beneath. The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning, and it changed the shape of everything. Evelina found her father sitting at the kitchen table with his head in his hands, a single sheet of paper trembling between his fingers. She recognized the seal before she read a single word, the mark of Harrow and Sons, the largest creditor holding what remained of her family's debts. "They want it settled within the month," her father said, his voice hollow. "All of it, every last shilling, or they'll take the house." Evelina sat down slowly across from him, reading the letter twice to be certain she hadn't misunderstood. The sum listed there was larger than anything she had imagined, larger than she thought possible for a family that had already sold nearly everything of value. "How did it grow so much?" she asked quietly. "Interest," her father said, refusing to meet her eyes, "and a debt I hadn't mentioned, to a private lender arranged after the business failed to keep us afloat through the winter." He finally looked up, and what she saw in his face frightened her more than the number on the page. "Evelina, I need you to understand what's at stake here. If the Duke were to make his intentions known, formally, publicly, the lenders would extend our time without question. No one calls in a debt against a family about to be joined with the Sinclair name." "You want me to push him," she said flatly, "to force something that hasn't happened yet because of a debt you kept hidden from me until now." "I want you to save this family," her father said, his voice cracking. "I want you to understand that pride will not keep a roof over our heads." The conversation left her shaking, torn between fury at her father's desperation and fear at the reality it revealed. She had spent weeks telling herself that her time with Alaric was separate from her family's troubles, a private thing untouched by debts and creditors. Now she understood how naive that belief had been. Every visit, every quiet conversation, carried a weight she hadn't fully acknowledged. A family's survival balanced on the uncertain foundation of a courtship that had never actually been named as such. She did not see Alaric for 4 days after that, uncertain how to face him with her father's demands echoing in her mind, uncertain whether she could look at him without wondering if her own feelings had somehow been tangled up in calculation from the very beginning. When his carriage finally arrived, she nearly turned him away at the door, ashamed of thoughts she hadn't chosen but couldn't quite escape either. "You've been avoiding me," he said, once they were alone in the small sitting room. "I have," she admitted. There seemed little point in pretending otherwise. "My father received troubling news about our debts. He believes that if you were to declare your intentions publicly, our creditors would grant us more time." Something flickered across Alaric's face, not surprise exactly, more like confirmation of something he had already suspected. "And what do you believe?" "I believe I hate that the question exists at all," she said, the words spilling out before she could soften them. "I hate that every kindness you've shown me now has a shadow attached to it, a suspicion that I'm encouraging this because of what it could solve rather than what it means to me. I don't know how to separate the two anymore, and it terrifies me." He was quiet for a long moment, studying her with the same careful attention he always gave her, though something more troubled lived behind his eyes now. "Evelina, I've known about your family's debts since before the gala. I made inquiries quietly after I remembered you from years ago. I know the exact figure your father owes and to whom." The confession landed like ice water. "You knew," she repeated slowly, "all this time and you said nothing." "I didn't want it to color what grew between us. I wanted you to choose my company because you wanted it, not because you believed I held some solution to your family's troubles. But you do hold the solution, she said, her voice rising with an emotion she couldn't quite name, somewhere between hurt and betrayal. You've known this whole time, and you let me believe this was simple, that it was just two people getting to know each other, while carrying knowledge that changes everything about how it could be interpreted. I didn't manipulate you, he said, his own voice sharper now than she had heard it before. I made no demands, no conditions, no expectations tied to what I knew. I simply chose not to burden our conversations with numbers and debts that were never yours to fix in the first place. That's not your decision to make, Evelina said, standing now, needing distance to think clearly. Whether to burden me with the truth was never yours to decide alone. You made a choice for me, the same way my father is trying to make choices for me now. And I am tired, Alaric, so tired of being managed by people who claim to care about my well-being while deciding for themselves what I'm strong enough to handle. The accusation hung heavy in the room. Alaric's jaw tightened, and for a moment she thought he might argue further, defend himself with more careful reasoning. Instead, something in his expression softened into something like regret. "You're right," he said quietly. "I should have told you from the beginning. I convinced myself I was protecting you, but I see now I was only protecting myself from watching your face change the way it's changing now." The honesty of it eased some of her anger, though not all of it. She sat back down slowly, the fight draining out of her, replaced by exhaustion. "What am I supposed to do with any of this, Alaric? My father wants a declaration. Your aunt questions my motives. Your sister mourns a husband whose death no one will explain to me. And now I learn you've been carrying my family's secrets this entire time without a word. You're supposed to decide," he said simply, "what you actually want, separate from everyone else's expectations. Not your father's need for rescue, not my aunt's suspicion, not even my own hope that this becomes something lasting. Just what you want, Evelina, stripped of every other voice pulling at you." It was, she realized, the first time anyone had asked her that question so directly in months. She sat with it in silence, aware of how rarely she had been given room to simply want something for herself, without immediately weighing how it would affect her father's fortunes or the family name she carried. Their conversation was interrupted by a sharp knock at the door, urgent enough that even her father, who had been keeping a careful distance since Alaric's arrival, hurried to answer it himself. Evelina heard raised voices in the entryway, one belonging to a man she didn't recognize, cold and formal, demanding to speak with her father immediately regarding an overdue account. Alaric rose without hesitation, moving toward the door before Evelina could stop him. She followed close behind, arriving in time to see a stern-faced man in dark clothing standing on their doorstep, a leather folder tucked under one arm, her father's face pale with a fear she had rarely seen him show so openly. "Mr. Marsh," the man was saying, "Harrow & Sons requires immediate confirmation of payment, or we will proceed with formal collection measures within the week." "Gentlemen," Alaric said, stepping forward with the same calm authority Evelina had first noticed the night of the gala. Perhaps this conversation would be better suited to a more private setting, and a later hour. The creditor's agent turned, recognition flickering across his face the moment he registered exactly who had spoken. "Your Grace, I wasn't aware you were involved in this matter." "I am now," Alaric said simply. "Send your particulars to my solicitor. We will discuss terms properly, rather than on a doorstep in front of neighbors." The man hesitated only briefly before nodding, clearly unwilling to press further against a duke's direct intervention, and retreated down the front steps with a hurried bow. Evelina's father sagged against the door frame, relief and humiliation warring across his features in equal measure. When the door finally closed, Evelina turned to Alaric, her earlier anger tangled now with something far more complicated. "You shouldn't have done that." "Perhaps not," he agreed. "But I wasn't going to stand by and watch a man threaten your family on your own doorstep, regardless of what remains unresolved between us. "This is exactly what I was afraid of," she said, her voice tight. "Now it will look exactly as my father hoped, as though you've stepped in to rescue us, as though everything between us has been decided by debts rather than by anything real." "Then let it look that way to everyone else," Alaric said, meeting her eyes directly. "I know the truth of my own intentions, even if the timing makes them difficult to prove to anyone watching from outside. The only opinion that matters to me right now is yours, Evelina. Do you believe I acted out of genuine care just now, or out of calculation?" She studied his face for a long moment, searching for the answer she already knew but hadn't wanted to admit fully, even to herself. "Care," she said finally, quietly. "Against my better judgment, and against every warning your own family has given me, I believe it was care." "Then hold on to that belief," he said, "when everyone else tries to convince you it was something else." But even as she nodded, agreeing to try, Evelina couldn't shake the unease settling deeper into her chest. Too many secrets moved beneath the surface of this courtship: her father's hidden debts, Alaric's quiet knowledge of them, his brother's unexplained death, his aunt's careful suspicion, his sister's guarded grief. She had the growing, uncomfortable sense that she was standing at the edge of something far larger than a simple romance between a fallen woman and a reluctant duke, something with roots that reached back years, before she had ever crossed that ballroom floor toward his outstretched hand. In the days between the creditor's visit and the arrival of that anonymous letter, Evelina found herself dragged into a different kind of battle entirely. One fought not with debts and solicitors, but with careful smiles and poisoned words. Mrs. Whitfield, a formidable matron who presided over half the city's drawing-room gossip, cornered her at a small charity luncheon Evelina had been reluctant to attend, but couldn't politely refuse. "My dear Miss Marsh," Mrs. Whitfield said, settling beside her with the practiced warmth of a woman who had spent decades wielding kindness as a weapon. "How fortunate you've been, rescued from ruin by a duke's whim. Tell me, does it not feel strange being handed everything you couldn't earn on your own merit?" The words were delivered with a smile, which made them sting all the more. Around them, several other women leaned in slightly, pretending interest in their tea while clearly straining to hear the exchange. "I've earned nothing yet, Mrs. Whitfield," Evelina replied evenly, refusing to let her voice waver. "The Duke has offered his company, nothing more. Whatever else you've heard has grown considerably in the telling." Of course," Mrs. Whitfield said, though her eyes glittered with the particular delight of a woman who had drawn blood and intended to keep drawing it. "Though one does wonder how a family so recently disgraced managed to catch such attention. Your father's debts are hardly a secret anymore, my dear. Some might call it convenient timing." Evelina felt heat rise in her cheeks, anger and humiliation tangled together, but she kept her expression carefully composed, remembering her mother's old lessons about never letting cruelty see that it had landed. "Convenient for whom, exactly? I hardly arranged my family's misfortune for the pleasure of being discussed at luncheons." A ripple of uncomfortable laughter moved through the nearby women, and Mrs. Whitfield's smile tightened slightly, clearly unaccustomed to having her barbs returned so directly. The conversation shifted after that, though Evelina spent the remainder of the luncheon aware of eyes tracking her every movement, every sip of tea, every polite word exchanged, as though she existed now only as a subject for speculation rather than a person in her own right. She left the luncheon exhausted in a way that had nothing to do with physical tiredness, worn down by the constant performance of composure required to survive in rooms full of people waiting for her to stumble. It was becoming clearer with each passing week that her relationship with Alaric, whatever it truly was, existed under a magnifying glass that distorted everything it touched, turning private moments into public theater and honest feelings into calculated strategy in the eyes of anyone watching from outside. That evening, restless and unable to settle, She found herself returning to Lady Constance's earlier words, the weight of them settling differently now than they had during their first meeting. She requested, through a note delivered by her father's remaining servant, a second audience with the older woman, uncertain what she hoped to gain from it but unwilling to keep circling the same unanswered questions alone. Lady Constance received her the following afternoon with less formality than before, though no less sharpness in her gaze. "Miss Marsh, I confess I didn't expect to see you again so soon, unless something troubling has brought you back." "Something has," Evelina admitted, taking the seat offered to her. "I've spent weeks now hearing pieces of a story no one will tell me completely. Your nephew's brother, his death. The careful way everyone in this family speaks around it rather than through it. I would like the truth, Lady Constance, if you're willing to give it to me." The older woman studied her for a long moment, weighing something behind her sharp eyes. "You're persistent," she said finally. "I'll grant you that. Very well. Edmund was the elder brother meant for the title Alaric now carries. He was charming, reckless, and utterly convinced that any debt could be managed through clever enough arrangements, no matter how deep the hole grew." "Debt," Evelina repeated carefully, "like my father's." "Worse," Lady Constance said, her voice growing quieter. "Edmund gambled extensively and hid the extent of it from this family for years, much as your father hid the full weight of his own troubles from you until recently. When the truth finally surfaced, it came with lenders far less patient than the ones your family has faced, men who cared nothing for titles or reputations, only repayment." "What happened to him?" Lady Constance's composure cracked briefly before she steadied it again. "He died before the debts were settled, Miss Marsh, in circumstances this family has worked very hard to keep from public record. I won't say more than that, not because I don't trust you, but because the details belong to Alaric to share, if and when he chooses to share them." Evelina sat with the weight of that admission, pieces shifting into place in her mind, forming a shape she didn't fully like. "That's why he knew about my father's debts before I told him. That's why he paid attention to the creditor at my door without hesitation. He's seen this exact situation before, hasn't he? A family drowning, a debt spiraling beyond control." "He has," Lady Constance said quietly. "And I imagine that recognition is precisely why he chose to raise his hand for you that night, Miss Marsh, though I would caution you against assuming his reasons were entirely about you at all. Sometimes we save others because we couldn't save the ones we loved first." The observation landed with unexpected force, reframing everything Evelina thought she understood about the gesture that had changed her life on New Year's Eve. Perhaps she hadn't been chosen for who she was at all, but for what she represented, a second chance at rescuing someone from the exact fate that had claimed his own brother. She left the Sinclair estate that evening with more questions than she had arrived with, the careful trust she had begun building with Alaric now shadowed by uncertainty about its true foundation. Was she loved for herself? Or was she simply the closest available echo of a grief he had never fully processed? That suspicion sharpened into certainty 3 days later, when a letter arrived at her door bearing no return address, written in a hand she didn't recognize, containing a single line that would unravel everything she thought she understood about the man she had begun, cautiously, to trust. "Ask him about the letters," it read. "Ask him what he paid for and why, long before New Year's Eve ever arrived." Evelina read the note 4 times before the shock settled into something colder, something that demanded action rather than paralysis. She said nothing to her father, tucking the paper into the lining of her writing desk, and spent the following 2 days quietly gathering whatever information she could without raising suspicion, uncertain whether she was chasing a lie meant to poison her trust or a truth someone wanted her to uncover before it was too late. The answer came from an unlikely source. Grayson, the elderly butler who had served her family for over a decade before their fortunes collapsed, and most of the household staff had to be let go, still visited occasionally, unwilling to fully abandon a family he had watched grow up. He arrived on a quiet afternoon with tea and old habits, and Evelina, desperate for anyone who might speak plainly, asked him directly whether he knew anything about the arrangement of her father's debts before the gala. Grayson hesitated, clearly torn between loyalty and discretion before finally admitting what he knew. There was a payment miss, several months back before the new year. A portion of your father's debt to the private lender, settled quietly, anonymously, through a solicitor who refused to name his client. Your father assumed it was a stroke of luck, some forgotten account finally settled in his favor. I always suspected otherwise, though I had no proof to offer him. Do you know the solicitor's name? Grayson provided it without hesitation, and within the hour, Evelina had written a carefully worded letter requesting confirmation of the payment's origin, citing her father's need for proper records now that further debts had come due. The reply arrived 2 days later, formal and cautious, but unmistakable in its confirmation. The payment had been arranged by the office representing the Duke of Sinclair, dated nearly 4 months before the New Year's gala, where she and Alaric had supposedly met for the very first time. The betrayal of it took her breath away, not because the money had been given, but because of what the timing meant. He had known her, or known of her, long before that night. He had been watching, quietly managing her family's collapse from a careful distance, and had said nothing, allowing her to believe their connection began the moment his hand rose above the crowd. She confronted him that same evening, refusing to wait even a day longer with the knowledge sitting like a stone in her chest. When he arrived for what he assumed would be an ordinary visit, she met him in the entryway rather than the sitting room, the solicitor's letter clutched in her hand. "How long have you known me?" she asked, without preamble, without any of the careful warmth that had grown between them over the past weeks. Alaric's expression shifted, surprise giving way quickly to something more guarded. "Evelina, what's happened?" "Answer the question. How long have you known me truly before that ballroom floor?" He was quiet for a long moment, his jaw tightening as he seemed to weigh, one final time, whether to continue the careful omission or finally lay it bare. "4 years," he said finally. "I've known of you for 4 years, Evelina, though we were never formally introduced until that night." The confirmation, even expected, still landed like a blow. "4 years," she repeated. "And in all that time, you never once thought to mention it. You let me believe a chance gesture at a gala was the beginning of everything between us, when in truth you'd been watching my family fall apart from a distance for years, arranging payments behind solicitors and anonymous accounts, deciding for yourself what I needed to know and when." "It wasn't like that," he said, stepping closer, though she held her ground, refusing to soften. "Let me explain properly everything, before you decide what kind of man I am based on half a story." "Then explain," she said, crossing her arms. "Start with why you paid off part of my father's debt without a word, months before you ever spoke to me directly." He exhaled slowly, some of his usual composure cracking under the weight of what he clearly understood was a conversation that had been delayed far too long. 4 years ago, I attended a dinner at the Ashcombe estate, much smaller than the gala, more of a private gathering among families still considered respectable. You were there, seated near the back, quiet, mostly overlooked by the older guests focused on more prominent company. A servant, a young man barely older than a boy, dropped an entire tray of glasses near the head table, and the host began berating him cruelly, threatening his position over an honest accident. Evelina's breath caught, an old memory surfacing that she had nearly forgotten entirely, buried under years of far more pressing troubles. "You stood," Alaric continued, "in front of an entire room of people far more powerful than either of you, and told the host, quite calmly, that accidents did not deserve cruelty, and that if he intended to dismiss the boy over broken glass, he ought to consider what kind of man that made him in front of his guests." The room went silent. The host, embarrassed, let the matter drop. You returned to your seat as though nothing extraordinary had happened at all. "I remember," she said quietly. "I'd forgotten entirely until just now." I never forgot, Alaric said. I was 17, newly aware of exactly how cruel and calculating people in our position could be toward those with less power, having just watched my own brother begin his slow collapse into debts he refused to acknowledge honestly. And there you were, a girl barely older than myself, willing to risk your own standing to defend someone who couldn't defend himself. I thought of that moment often over the years, long after I'd forgotten most other faces from that period of my life. So you watched me, she said, the words tasting strange, somewhere between flattering and unsettling. For 4 years from a distance without ever once approaching. I watched from a distance because approaching would have meant something entirely different before your family's fortunes changed, he said. You were courted by half the eligible men in the city then, surrounded by attention I had no wish to add to. I told myself there would be time, eventually, to properly introduce myself, once Edmund's affairs were settled and my own responsibilities allowed room for anything beyond duty. And then everything changed, Evelina said slowly, understanding beginning to form. My father's business collapsed. Your brother's debts finally caught up with him. Both of our families fell apart around the same time. Yes, Alaric admitted. And when I learned of your family's troubles, I couldn't simply watch a second family destroyed by debt without acting, not after everything Edmund's collapse had already cost this family. I arranged the payment anonymously because I didn't want you to feel obligated to me, didn't want gratitude or debt shaping whatever might eventually grow between us. I wanted, when the time finally came, for you to choose my company because you wanted it, not because you owed me anything for the assistance. But I didn't know, Evelina said, her voice tightening with frustration that hadn't fully faded despite the growing sympathy building alongside it. You made that choice for me, Alaric, exactly as you did with the debts you knew about more recently. You keep deciding on my behalf, what I'm strong enough to know and when I'm allowed to know it. You're right, he said again, the same admission he had offered once before, though this time it carried the weight of a much deeper truth. I've spent years protecting people from difficult truths, ever since watching Edmund destroy himself rather than admit how deep his troubles ran. I convinced myself that silence was kindness. I see now it was simply another form of control, gentler perhaps, but control nonetheless. The honesty of the admission eased some of her anger, though the hurt remained, tangled with a growing understanding of exactly how much this man had shaped himself around loss and guilt long before she ever entered his life directly. Why raise your hand that night? She asked finally, quieter now. After 4 years of watching from a distance, why choose that particular moment to finally step forward? Alaric's expression softened, something raw and unguarded finally surfacing beneath his careful composure. Because I watched you stand alone in that ballroom, surrounded by people who once called themselves your friends, refusing to let them see you break, and I recognized all at once that I had spent 4 years protecting my own comfort by staying distant, telling myself I was respecting your independence, when really I was simply afraid. Afraid of caring for someone the way I'd cared for Edmund, only to watch them fall apart despite everything I tried to do to help. And that night, you decided the fear wasn't worth the cost anymore. That night, he said, I decided I would rather risk everything, my reputation, my family's expectations, even your own anger at discovering the truth eventually, than watch you stand alone in a room for one more moment when I had the power to change it. Evelina studied his face for a long time, weighing 4 years of silence against the raw honesty finally standing in front of her, uncertain whether trust could survive a foundation built on so much careful, well-intentioned secrecy. I need time, she said finally. Not to decide whether I believe you, Alaric, I believe every word, but to decide whether I can build something real with a man who still, even now, chooses what I'm allowed to know before I've asked for it. He nodded slowly, accepting the distance she needed without argument, though something in his eyes carried the fear that this might be the moment everything finally came apart between them. 4 years of careful watching undone by a single conversation neither of them could take back. After he left, Evelina sat alone in the darkened sitting room for a long time, the solicitor's letter still resting on the small table beside her, its careful, formal language now representing something far more complicated than a simple financial transaction. She thought of the version of herself from 4 years ago, the girl who had stood up for a frightened servant without a second thought, never imagining that single moment of instinct would echo forward into every part of her life to come. Her father found her there near midnight, still awake, still turning the day's revelations over in her mind. He hovered in the doorway, uncertain, sensing correctly that something significant had shifted. "You look troubled," he said carefully. "Has something happened with the Duke?" Evelina considered how much to share, aware that her father's own desperation had already complicated so much of what should have remained simple between herself and Alaric. "I learned something today, Papa. Something that changes how I understand everything that's happened since New Year's Eve." She told him carefully about the payment made months before the gala, about the 4 years Alaric had quietly watched from a distance before finally stepping forward. Her father listened in silence, his expression shifting through surprise, then something like shame. "I owe him more than I realized then," her father said quietly when she finished. "Not just the debt itself, but the years he spent watching our family struggle without ever using that knowledge against us, without ever calling in the debt or using it to demand anything in return." "That's not quite the point I'm troubled by," Evelina said, though she understood her father's instinct to focus on practical relief rather than the deeper complexity she was still working through. "The point is that he made decisions about my life, about what I deserved to know, for years, without my consent. However good his intentions, Papa, I need to understand whether that's something I can build a future around, or whether it's a pattern that will simply continue, gentler perhaps, but no less controlling." Her father was quiet for a long moment, considering her words with more care than he usually managed these days. "Your mother once told me something similar, you know, early in our marriage before you were born. I made a decision on her behalf, thinking I was protecting her from a worry she needn't carry. She was furious, far more furious than I expected, and she told me that love without honesty was simply a prettier kind of cage." Evelina looked up, surprised by the memory, one she had never heard before. "What did you do?" "I learned," her father said simply. "Slowly, imperfectly, but I learned to ask rather than assume, to share rather than protect through silence. It took years, Evelina, and I won't pretend I always succeeded even after learning the lesson. But your mother forgave the mistake because she saw the effort that followed it, the genuine change rather than empty apology." The words settled into her thinking long after her father had retired for the night, offering a framework she hadn't considered before. Perhaps the question wasn't whether Alaric had made a mistake in his careful, protective silence, but whether he was capable of genuine change now that the truth stood fully exposed between them, whether 4 years of guarded distance could give way to something built on honesty rather than careful management. She did not send word to Alaric the following day, nor the day after that, needing the space to sit with her own uncertainty rather than rushing toward either forgiveness or final rejection simply to end the discomfort of not knowing. It was during this quiet stretch of days that Lady Miriam, unexpectedly, arrived at her door, dressed once again in her dark mourning colors, her expression softer than it had been during their first brief meeting at the estate. "I heard you learned the truth," Miriam said, once Evelina had invited her into the small sitting room. "About the payment, about the years he watched you before ever stepping forward." "You knew," Evelina said, not quite a question. "I've known for years," Miriam admitted. "Alaric confided in me not long after Edmund's death, when grief made him more open than his usual guarded self. He spoke of a young woman who had shown more courage in a single moment than most people manage in a lifetime, though he never once mentioned pursuing you directly, not until circumstances forced his hand. Why are you telling me this now? Miriam considered the question carefully before answering. Because I watched my husband destroy himself through secrecy, Miss Marsh, through a refusal to share his troubles honestly with anyone who might have helped him carry the weight sooner. I recognized the same instinct in Alaric, softened by better intentions, but rooted in the same fear of burdening others with difficult truths. I don't say this to excuse what he's done. I say it because I believe, genuinely, that he is capable of learning differently than Edmund ever did, if given the chance and the honesty to do so. The visit left Evelina with more to consider than she had expected. Another voice added to the chorus already shaping her decision, though ultimately she understood that the choice belonged to her alone, built from her own judgment rather than the accumulated opinions of everyone circling this fragile, complicated courtship. 5 days of silence stretched between them before Evelina finally understood what she needed to decide, and it was not, in the end, a question of whether Alaric had wronged her. It was a question of what she wanted to build going forward, knowing everything she now knew about the man behind the careful composure. She sent word requesting he call on her, and he arrived within the hour, arriving with none of his usual measured calm, something more anxious in the set of his shoulders as he entered the sitting room. "I've thought of little else these past days," he said, before she could speak first. "I understand if the silence means you've decided against continuing this, Evelina. I won't pretend the thought hasn't cost me considerable sleep." "Sit down, Alaric," she said, gesturing to the chair across from her own. "I have questions and I need honest answers, not careful ones." He sat, watching her with an attention that had grown familiar over the past months, though something more vulnerable lived in his expression now than she had seen before. "If I ask you something difficult in the future," she said, "something about your family, your finances, your own fears, will you tell me directly, even if your instinct is to protect me from it first?" "Yes," he said, without hesitation. "I've had 5 days to sit with exactly how much damage my careful silences have caused, Evelina, not just with you, but likely with Edmund as well, though I didn't recognize it clearly until now. I built a habit of managing difficult truths alone, believing it kindness, when really it was simply easier than trusting others with the full weight of things. I don't want to build whatever we have on that same foundation." "That's not enough," she said gently though firmly. "Intentions aren't proof, Alaric. I need more than a promise made in the heat of nearly losing something." "Then ask me anything," he said. "Right now, this moment, prove to yourself that the promise means something beyond words." She considered for a moment, then asked the question that had been sitting quietly beneath everything else since her conversation with Lady Constance. "How did Edmund actually die? Your aunt wouldn't tell me the full story. She said it belonged to you to share." Alaric's jaw tightened, old grief surfacing visibly across his features, though he did not look away from her gaze, did not retreat into careful deflection the way she half expected. "He took his own life," he said quietly, the words clearly costing him considerable effort. "Overwhelmed by debts he'd hidden from everyone, convinced there was no path forward that wouldn't destroy the family name entirely. I found the letter he left 3 days after we buried him, delayed in delivery through some clerical error that still haunts me more than I can properly express." The confession landed with a weight that finally explained so much of what she had sensed beneath his careful composure, the depth of guilt that clearly still lived in him, the particular urgency with which he had acted the moment he learned of her own family's collapsing fortunes. "I'm so sorry," she said softly, reaching across the small distance between their chairs to rest her hand over his. "Alaric, I'm so deeply sorry. I've carried the belief for years now that if I had simply asked more directly, pushed past his careful deflections, insisted on knowing the truth of his troubles sooner, I might have saved him," Alaric said, his voice rough with an old, unhealed pain. "When I learned of your family's debts, I told myself I would not make the same mistake twice, that I would act before silence had the chance to cause irreversible harm. I see now that in trying to avoid one kind of failure, I simply created another, deciding for you what you could handle, exactly as Edmund once decided for all of us that his own troubles were his burden alone to carry. The parallel, laid bare now in his own words, eased something in Evelina's chest that she hadn't realized was still tight with doubt. This was not manipulation dressed in kindness. This was a man shaped by profound loss, making imperfect choices out of genuine fear rather than calculation, finally recognizing the pattern clearly enough to name it honestly. "Thank you," she said quietly, "for telling me the truth, even though it clearly costs you a great deal to say it aloud." "You deserved it from the beginning," he said. "I understand now that protecting you from difficult truths was never actually protection at all. It was simply another version of the same fear that cost my family so much already." They sat together in comfortable silence for a while after that, something new settling between them, built now on honesty rather than careful management, though Evelina understood this single conversation could not undo years of habit overnight. Trust, she suspected, would need to be built gradually, through consistent choices rather than a single dramatic confession, however sincere. Word of their private reconciliation did not stay private for long. Within a week, whispers had already begun circulating that the Duke intended to make a formal declaration at the upcoming winter ball hosted by the Ashcombe family, the very location where their story had first begun nearly a year ago. Evelina found herself, once again, at the center of speculation she hadn't fully chosen, though this time the whispers carried less cruelty and more genuine curiosity about how the story would finally resolve. Lady Constance requested one final audience before the ball, her expression less guarded than during their previous meetings, though still carrying the weight of her usual careful judgment. "I've watched you these past months, Miss Marsh," she said, without preamble. "I confess I expected you to either flee at the first sign of difficulty or to cling desperately to the security my nephew's position offered. You've done neither." "I've considered both, at various points," Evelina admitted honestly. "But neither felt true to what I actually wanted, once I stripped away everyone else's expectations, including my own father's desperation and your careful suspicion." "And what do you actually want, now that you've had time to consider it properly?" Evelina met the older woman's sharp gaze directly. "I want a partnership built on honesty, Lady Constance, not rescue. I want a man who trusts me with difficult truths rather than deciding on my behalf what I'm strong enough to bear. I believe Alaric is capable of that, though I understand it will take continued effort on both our parts, not simply a single conversation." Something like genuine respect crossed Lady Constance's features, replacing the guarded suspicion that had colored every previous interaction between them. "That," she said, "is precisely the answer I was hoping to hear, though I confess I doubted I would hear it from anyone my nephew brought before me. Perhaps you'll do well together after all, Miss Marsh." The path to that ball, however, was not entirely smooth. 2 days before the event, a fresh rumor began circulating through the city's drawing rooms, sharper and more dangerous than any gossip that had come before it. Someone, it seemed, had learned of the anonymous payment Alaric made months before the gala and twisted the timeline into something uglier than the truth, suggesting that Evelina's father had orchestrated the entire courtship from the very beginning, arranging for his daughter to be positioned at the gala precisely because he already knew of the Duke's quiet financial involvement. Evelina learned of the rumor from Mrs. Whitfield herself, who arrived at her door under the guise of concern, though her eyes carried the same glittering satisfaction Evelina remembered from the charity luncheon months earlier. "I thought you should hear it from a friend rather than a stranger," Mrs. Whitfield said, settling into the sitting room without invitation. "People are saying your father knew of the Duke's payment all along, that the entire gala appearance was arranged between the two men beforehand, a business transaction dressed up as romance for the sake of appearances. The accusation struck at exactly the wound still healing between Evelina and her father, the desperation he had shown, the pressure he had applied. For one unsettling moment, she wondered whether there was any truth buried in the poisonous rumor, whether her father had known more than he'd ever admitted to her directly. "That's not what happened," Evelina said, keeping her voice steady despite the unease twisting in her stomach. "Of course not, dear," Mrs. Whitfield said, in a tone that made clear she believed exactly the opposite. "Though I imagine the Duke's family will want reassurance before Saturday's ball, given how much weight his declaration will carry in front of the entire city." After Mrs. Whitfield left, Evelina confronted her father directly, needing certainty rather than doubt festering beneath the surface of an already fragile trust. "Papa, I need you to tell me honestly. Did you know about the payment before I discovered it myself? Did you arrange anything with Alaric before that gala?" Her father's face went pale, and for a terrible moment she feared the answer would confirm the rumor's cruel insinuation. "No," he said finally, firmly. "Evelina, I swear to you, I knew nothing of any payment until you told me yourself. I have made many mistakes where you're concerned, desperate mistakes I regret deeply, but I did not arrange your meeting with the Duke, and I did not know of his involvement in our finances until it was already done." She studied his face carefully, searching for any trace of the deflection she had learned to recognize during the darkest weeks of their family's collapse, and found only sincere, frightened honesty. "I believe you," she said finally, relief loosening some of the tightness in her chest. But belief alone would not silence a rumor already spreading through every drawing room in the city, and Evelina understood, with rising urgency, that something needed to be done before Saturday's ball transformed Alaric's honest declaration into fresh scandal, built on a lie neither of them had told. She went to him that same evening, finding him in his study poring over correspondence with the same quiet intensity he brought to everything. He looked up the moment she entered, immediately reading the tension in her expression. "You've heard it too," he said, not a question. "The whole city has heard it by now, I imagine," Evelina said. "They're saying my father orchestrated everything, that your payment was arranged with his knowledge from the beginning. That Saturday's declaration would simply be the final act of a business transaction dressed as romance." "It's a lie," Alaric said, his jaw tight with barely controlled anger. "A cruel, convenient lie, likely spread by someone who resents seeing either of our families recover from the difficulties we've faced." "I know it's a lie," Evelina said, "but knowing the truth privately won't undo the damage if it spreads unchecked before Saturday. Your aunt already questioned my motives once. I won't have her, or anyone else, believing this fabrication colors everything we've built." Alaric was quiet for a moment, considering the problem with the same careful attention he brought to every difficulty. "Then we answer it directly," he said finally. "Not with denial whispered through intermediaries, but with the truth, spoken plainly, in front of everyone who matters, before the rumor has a chance to calcify into accepted fact." "At the ball," Evelina said, understanding his meaning. "At the ball," he confirmed. "I had intended to speak certain words there regardless. Perhaps it's fitting that I speak the full truth alongside them, rather than allow a poisoned version of our story to stand unchallenged in the minds of everyone watching." The plan settled something anxious in Evelina's chest, though it did nothing to calm the nerves that built steadily over the following 2 days, each hour bringing her closer to a public reckoning that would either cement everything she and Alaric had built or unravel it entirely in front of the very society that had once cast her aside so easily. The winter ball arrived on a crisp evening nearly identical to the one that had started everything a year prior. The same grand ballroom filled with glittering chandeliers and swirling silk, though Evelina walked through the doors this time with an entirely different bearing than the frightened, humiliated woman who had once stood alone by a pillar, waiting to be overlooked. She wore a new gown, not extravagant, but carefully chosen. A deep blue that Alaric had once mentioned reminded him of a particular evening sky he'd admired as a boy. She caught Charlotte Bryce's eye across the room, and this time it was Charlotte who looked away first, uncertain how to face a woman who had weathered a year of scrutiny and emerged, somehow, more certain of herself than before. Alaric found her near the same marble pillar where he had first noticed her a year ago, though this time he did not simply gesture from across the room. He crossed the floor himself, taking her hand in front of the gathered crowd, drawing gasps and whispers that neither of them paid any mind to. "A year ago," he said, loud enough now for the nearby guests to hear clearly, "I watched a woman stand alone in this room, refusing to let anyone see her break, and I recognized something in her courage I had spent years admiring from a careful distance. Some of you have heard a story this week claiming that her father arranged our meeting, that a payment made months earlier was part of some quiet business transaction between two men. That story is false, and I would rather correct it plainly here in front of all of you than let it stand as truth. The payment was mine alone, made without her father's knowledge, out of respect for a woman I had admired long before I ever had the courage to approach her. I made mistakes since then, choices born of fear rather than trust, and she called me on every single one of them rather than simply accepting less than honesty deserved." The room had gone properly silent now, every eye fixed on the couple standing in the center of the ballroom floor, the same scene that had launched a year of gossip now transforming into something entirely different. "Evelina Marsh," Alaric continued, lowering himself onto one knee despite the audience, despite his aunt's sharp intake of breath somewhere near the head table, despite every careful expectation of propriety that usually governed such moments. "I am asking you properly, honestly, with nothing hidden and nothing decided on your behalf, whether you would do me the honor of becoming my wife." Evelina looked down at him, at the careful vulnerability he had learned to show rather than hide, at the year of difficult honesty that had brought them to exactly this moment, built on something far sturdier than a single dramatic gesture at a New Year's gala. "Yes," she said, her voice steady and sure, carrying clearly across the silent ballroom. "Yes, Alaric, I will." The room erupted into applause and startled exclamations, Charlotte Bryce among the loudest, though Evelina barely noticed any of it, her attention fixed entirely on the man rising to meet her, his composure finally, fully unguarded in front of an audience that had spent a year speculating about exactly this outcome. Lady Constance approached later that evening, once the initial excitement had settled into dancing and quiet celebration, offering a rare, genuine smile. "Welcome to the family, Miss Marsh. I suspect you'll manage us all rather well." Lady Miriam found her near the edge of the dance floor as well, her dark mourning colors finally softened by a single blue ribbon that matched Evelina's gown. "Edmund would have liked you," she said simply. "He always did admire courage, even when he couldn't quite manage it himself." The following New Year's Eve, exactly 1 year after Evelina had first walked into that ballroom alone, unwanted and humiliated, she arrived instead on Alaric's arm as his wife, greeted warmly by a room that had once looked away from her entirely. This time, there was no empty chair waiting to remind her of what she'd lost. There was only a seat beside her husband, reserved and certain, exactly where she belonged, built not on rescue or pity, but on a year of hard-won honesty that neither of them intended to abandon now that the difficult work of trust had finally been done. As the clock struck midnight and the ballroom erupted into cheers once again, Evelina Marsh, now Duchess Sinclair, turned to the man beside her and found, this time, that she had absolutely no doubts left about exactly why he had raised his hand for her, all those months ago, when no one else in the room had bothered to save her a seat.